When my son Christopher was born, I remember the urgency of the delivery. Heart rates were dropping. The quick movements of doctors and nurses. A child introduced into the world, not crying and not moving. Seemingly lifeless even as he was moved to a crash cart. And I was helpless. Moments seemed like hours and days until finally I heard a gasp and a cry. No longer lifeless, but still helpless. February 25th, 1999, a baby boy, Christopher Isaiah Barrett, was born around 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember the wanting to take control, to do something, even as Christopher, my son, was delivered. And you expect the initial cry and the gasp and kind of that movie thing where they spank the baby on the butt. Do they even do that anymore? Yeah, I don't think so, right? But when Christopher was delivered, I heard nothing. And I remember that there were 2 doctors in the room, which was unusual, and 4 or 5 nurses. And I found out later that they were, what do you call them, neonatal, intensive care, trauma, whatever. I mean, they had a long title on their names because they knew that Christopher was in distress. They knew he was in distress, and so they were ready. And all I wanted to do was take control and be his dad. I wanted to protect him. But for a time, I was helpless. Chris, too, as a newborn, was helpless. He would depend on his parents to feed him, to clothe him, and to protect him. He would depend on us to nurture him and provide for his needs. Even today, though my son is an adult and a junior in college, there are still times when I can see when he feels just a little bit helpless. Today, we begin our preparation for Advent, and yeah, if you want to gasp, go right ahead, because it feels like the end of the year, especially the last quarter, has accelerated into warp speed. We're coming up into Christmas, guys. But today, rather than wait for Advent to come and for us to launch into the traditional telling of Christmas stories and everything that went on around the birth of Christ, we're going to spend some time the first couple of weeks getting ready for that. We're going to prepare for Advent. Now, we often think of Advent as a time of celebration when we remember the birth of Jesus Christ and we celebrate Christmas. We have a play in church. I think that comes up second week, the 15th. So second Sunday, right? First, third. Yeah, wow. Okay, so the 15th, we're going to have a play in church. Throughout Advent, we sing great Christmas hymns and songs. And we generally look forward to Christmas morning. I know I do. We think back to that idyllic time when Joseph and Mary found themselves without lodging as Jesus was about to be born. Shepherds told of the impending birth by choirs of angels, and wise men arrived from the east with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And while it's good to let our hearts and minds go back to that wonderful event, what Advent really is about is our preparation to receive the King of Kings when he comes the second time. Advent is our way of focusing on the second coming of Christ our King when he will descend upon the cloud with an army of angels to fight the final fight against evil and begin his 1,000-year reign on earth. So even as we remember the stories of his birth, we also prepare for his return. And that brings us to today, when we think about the helpless, the children amongst us who represent not only the greatness in the kingdom of heaven, but who represent the kingdom of heaven itself. Now, when we think back to the stories of Christ's birth, my guess is that our brains often go to kind of into Norman Rockwell mode. I can't get past, especially if it works out well, right? We have a Christmas Eve service. I just imagine gently falling snow, a real soft blanket of snow on the ground, not on the roads, of course. I imagine coming into this space, I imagine dimmed lights, candles flaring, singing Christmas hymns together. Those are the kinds of things that I think about when I think about Christmas. And we all know the stories, right? Every year, pastors around the globe take a familiar set of stories and we try to retell it in new and interesting ways, even though everybody's already heard the stories. And part of me wonders, why do we even try? Why don't we just tell the story, right? Because the story stands by itself. We think about nativity set Christmas with camels, donkeys, wise men, shepherds, and of course the Holy Family, all huddled together around the stable. Everything seems right. But do we ever spend any significant amount of time thinking about just how helpless baby Jesus was? Just how much he relied on his parents to protect him, to raise him. You know, Joseph doesn't get a whole lot of time. You know, he gets kind of time going up into the birth because of everything that went on with Mary's pregnancy. But once we kind of get through that, Joseph falls off the map. We don't hear a lot about him. But you know what? Jesus had to learn his skills from somebody, didn't he? He had a dad at home who taught him stuff, who helped raise and nurture him alongside Mary. And one of the questions I have is when we think about a helpless baby, when we think about the stories that we read, when we think about Mary, Joseph, and Jesus fleeing to Egypt because Herod is hunting down all the kids so that he can put them to death, do we think that God would allow his son to be taken by Herod? Do we think that Herod would be allowed to take a baby Jesus and put him to death and thereby short-circuit the entire plan of salvation for us before it ever gained any traction? I think about a lot of stuff when I consider the Christmas story. Deep theological stuff, to be sure, but also kind of crazy questions like, did Mary and Joseph have a diaper service? How about this? Did Jesus ever cry at 2 o'clock in the morning because he was hungry? Right? Or did Mary and Joseph get to sleep through the night every night? I can't remember the name of the song, but there's a song in our hymnal talking about Jesus not crying. No sound did he make. And I just got to tell you, I think the hymn writer got it wrong on that one, because I think Jesus cried plenty. But today we're going to focus on the seemingly helpless and, societally speaking, insignificant amongst us. Kids, don't get mad at me, but we're talking about our kids today. Society throughout history has viewed children, especially the younger children, as insignificant, as the lowest on the hierarchical totem pole, if you will, until those kids could somehow earn a living, do chores. They just were not highly thought of. In many cultures, children are liabilities and considered to be of little significance to society, say that 3 times real quick, until they're able to contribute back to society. Now, in our brief passage today, Jesus is asked by his disciples, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? This entire question is focused on status, right? And we hear this throughout some of Jesus' dealings with his disciples. They're always wanting to know, Jesus, am I better than this guy over here? Am I elevated just a little bit more? And they ask, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? This question that focuses on status is very similar to much of the 18th chapter of Matthew. Here, the disciples are waiting to hear who has curried favor with Jesus, who will sit at his right hand, and who will be the top dog. In fact, Peter has largely been singled out as Jesus' top guy, right? Jesus has already told Peter at this point that upon Peter would be built the church. It's not really what was said, right? But that's the way it reads. Peter seems to be the guy. And here, the question is raised, and I think it's a fair question. Jesus, clarify once and for all, who is going to be the greatest? Everyone wants that situation clarified. And Jesus doesn't disappoint, but neither does he respond in the way the disciples expected. Instead, Jesus pulls in a young child, pulls him right into the middle of their group, and says, be like this little one. Be like this child. Since we have the benefit of hindsight, we get to consider more than just this passage. So I want to redirect us just a little bit to the Last Supper. And what did Jesus do before the Last Supper really truly began? He tied a towel around his waist and he got down on his knees. This is the creator of the universe. And he got down on his knees and he washed the feet of his disciples. Dirty, nasty, stinky feet. And he washed their feet. What did he teach them? He was teaching them about servant discipleship. He was teaching them that in order to be great, you had to humble yourself. Jesus is teaching that exact same thing right now. He's teaching them about discipleship, humility, and serving others, just like in this story. The child represents the lowest level of society's hierarchy. And if the disciples are worried about who will be the greatest, Jesus' response was quite simple. You have to be like the least of these. You cannot seek to elevate yourself, because when you seek to elevate yourself, you go against the very nature of God the Father. Because God isn't concerned about status. And if we go before the throne and we're concerned more about status than how our hearts are right with God, then we have missed the boat. And Jesus leaves a very stern, dire warning for those of you who are like that, who are worried about status more than other stuff. You're not going to see the kingdom of heaven. It's one of those warning shots from Jesus that we can't ignore. You see, rank and privilege are things that are taught as we get older. Rank and privilege aren't things that matter to a child. They matter to us as we get older. In fact, for children to start worrying about rank and status and privilege, we have to teach them that stuff. We teach them how to move away from God. This whole desire to be the greatest runs against the very nature of God, my friends. Runs against the very nature of God, and Jesus tells them right here, unless you let go of that nonsense, unless you don't worry about that, you got to let it go. But unless you do that, unless you become like a child and stop worrying about status, then you will not spend eternity with God. Now, we can learn a lot from our kids, in case you haven't noticed. I've had a chance to spend the last little over a month with our junior high youth group. I have been absolutely impressed with some of the questions that have come up during that time. The group, in the last couple of weeks, have actually named themselves. They're calling themselves We Believe. And we're going to sing a song that kind of represents what that belief is here in just a little while. But I hear questions on Wednesday nights. Like this past Wednesday, one of the questions that I got was, if Satan repented of his sins and was truly sorry for what he'd done, would Jesus forgive him and let him back into heaven? If you hadn't noticed, that's deep theological thinking right there. That is a great question. It's a great question, and we're going to be talking about that this upcoming Wednesday. But we've got a lot we could learn from our kids. We have a real treasure in our children. When all the kids were kind of spread out across the floor here, my heart was smiling. My heart was smiling. We have a real treasure, and we need to protect this treasure. Jesus clearly has a really high regard for children, as well as those with a childlike faith. In fact, we need to learn some things from them in order for us to be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. As we near the conclusion of our service today, we're going to invite our kids, all of our kids. I'm going to invite them to come up here. And David's going to play a little something for us, and he's just going to keep playing until his fingers fall off or we're done, whichever happens first, Dave. But I'm going to invite all the kids to come up here. And then I'm going to invite anybody who wants to come up here just to lay hands on our kids. We're going to pray for our kids. We're going to spend time up here praying for our kids. I'm going to pray out loud, but I'm going to invite anybody who wants to just come up and pray over the kids. If you don't feel like coming up and you just want to pray from the pews, that's fine. We're also going to bless these boxes. I don't know if anyone has ever had any dealings with Samaritan's Purse. This is Operation Christmas Child. These shoe boxes, this one's tagged for a girl aged 10 to 14 years. And I'm going to probably mess this up so I can't close it again, but you know what? It is what it is. There's stuff in here that will help a child learn. There's stuff in here that will help a child play. And with all these shoe boxes that go out, missionaries go with them, and they take the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, and they teach kids about Jesus. There was a time when I would have loved to have had one of these boxes to give to my son Chris. When his mom and I went through a divorce, I had nothing. It was the only year that I wasn't able to afford a gift for my child at Christmas. And these boxes are all going to find their way into hands, little hands, that will not receive a single gift at Christmas other than these boxes. They're going to receive these physical, tangible gifts. They're also going to receive the gift, the teachings of Jesus Christ. We're going to pray over all that stuff today. This whole service today is about kids. Because unless we get things figured out as adults, until we learn how to learn from the kids and humble ourselves and not worry about status and all the other junk that the disciples and us worry about, we will not see the kingdom of heaven. So I'm going to invite our kids to come down. I'm going to invite David to play. And then once the kids are up here, come on up here and let's pray for our kids today. David?